Our Bible study continues today with Ecclesiastes chapter 3. If you will, please turn in your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and let's begin. Verses 1 through 8, we find that everything has its time. Verse 1, Solomon wrote, To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. In verses 1 through 8, we see that Solomon describes how that there is a time for everything. Solomon describes the things done by man under heaven in verses 1 through 8. Verse 9, what profit has the worker from that in which he labors? Unseen by man is said to be the work that God does from the beginning to end in verse 11. And in verse 17, it says, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. Now in verse 1, he mentions how that there is a time for everything. There's a time for every purpose under heaven. And so for every purpose, every event, every matter, every activity, there's a time. There's this appointed time, he says, for all these things. This time appointed by God. The works of men are subject to the will of God. For example, in James 4 and 15 of the New Testament, James, the disciple of the Lord, said, Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall do this or that. And so, if the Lord wills, we shall live. We shall do this, we shall do that. And so keeping God in our plans. In verses 3 through 8, Solomon gives a list of things that are done under heaven. He lists 14 things, opposites, each balancing the other. We might characterize each as positive or negative, constructive or destructive. Verse 2. He says, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted. And so he begins by saying there is a time to be born. Man has no control over the time of his birth. We come into this world under heaven by no power or no will of our own. There is also a time to die. He says it is certain that one day man will die. This too is outside of the power or the will, the power of us to change. There is a time to plant. Man plants seeds or sets plants in the ground to grow with intentions to grow. Man can fertilize and water the soil which he has planted, the crops he has grown. But ultimately, the growth is outside of his power to control. He must be patient. And so there is also a time to pluck or to uproot what is planted. Man plants in its season and plucks what he has planted when the season for the harvest has ended. And so there is a time to be born. Another version reads a time to give birth. Of course, in both instances, we see the necessity of the will of God. Man has no control over when he is born. And everything in this world, we see the hand of God in creation. Hebrews 9 and 27, he says, and it is appointed for man to die once, but after this, the judgment. And so as there is a time to die, there is also a time to be judged. And we see about judgment in this book of Ecclesiastes. Verse 3, he says, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. And so we begin with the first, there is a time to kill. Man might wound another so as to take his life. There's also a time to heal. Man might bind the wounds of another so that he may heal. However, the power to heal is outside of man's ability. Likewise, those who think they are terminal may actually recover. Next, he says there's a time to break down. Man may break down something which he has made or built. He may tear down something that he has erected. There's also a time to build up. Something which man intends to endure may crumble earlier than he ever expected. Likewise, something which man thought would be temporary may last for a long, long time. And so we see that a lot of these things are outside of the will, the power of man. And so, as James said, if it be the Lord's will, we'll live and we'll do this or that. Verse 4. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. And so he begins by saying there is a time to weep. Man may feel sorrow, which he can express by shedding tears. There's also time to laugh. Man may also feel joy, which he can express verbally, audibly. Sometimes a man can feel sorrow, even as he laughs. He might also weep with joy. Again, looking at Proverbs 14 and 13. He says there is a time to mourn. Man might weep as he mourns. There's also a time to dance. Man may dance for joy. And so even the emotions of joy and sorrow, along with how we express such emotions, with laughing and weeping, may be outside of our control. James 4 and 9, again, the disciple James said, lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. In this particular passage, he's telling them to express their repentance. Instead of laughing over sin, instead lament and mourn and weep over one's sin. Instead of sin being a laughing matter, let your laughing be turned to mourning over your sin. Your joy, let it be turned to gloom over your practice of sin. And hopefully these will motivate you to repent. James 5 and 13. Is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing psalms. And so there are occasions that we may pray. We may pray when we suffer. We may also pray when we're happy too and thankful. And we may sing when we're cheerful. Then again, we may also sing when we're sorrowful too. I think about two men who prayed while in prison in Acts chapter 16. Paul and Silas of Philippi, and we remember the account of how Paul and Silas prayed to God and sang psalms. Number 5, he says there's a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. And so the first, he says, there's a time to cast away stones. The idea of throwing stones or scattering stones about. Some have suggested this may be a reference to men casting stones on the land of their enemies, such as to make it unfit for cultivation. You may look at 2 Kings chapter 3, 19, and also in verse 25. 2 Kings 3, 19, and also in verse 25, where you see this practice of men casting stones on an enemy's land. Something similar to salting the land as if to make it not to grow. And so he also says there is a time to gather stones. This may refer to how men may gather stones so as to clear the ground or to clear good ground, good land, so they can plant, so that it can be planted. Again, look at passages like Isaiah 5 and verse 2, and again, 2 Kings 3:19 and 25. And so there is a time to hinder, and there's a time to promote. He says, too, there is a time to embrace, verse 5. Men may accept something or someone. There's also a time to refrain from embracing or to shun embracing. This may also be an occasion of man which he keeps himself from something. Solomon taught that embracing wisdom can bring honor in Proverbs 4 and verse 8, while embracing the immoral can bring shame, Proverbs 5 and verse 20. Verse 6. He says there is a time to gain and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away. And so he begins by saying there's a time to gain. A man makes plans to go to a place, to buy and to sell, and to make a profit. We saw this in James in chapter 4, 13 to 16. He may have those plans, but is that what will happen? He may find gain. He may search and seek and find what he's looking for. He may search for something and find it. However, there's also, he says, a time to lose. And so he may intend to make a profit, but end up losing or giving up as lost. And so he may search for something and not find it. Again, in James 4, 13 to 16, the disciples said, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, and make a profit, whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time, and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil." And so Solomon says there's a time to gain, a time to lose, time to keep, and a time to throw away. And so one may have intentions, for example, to gain profit, but then again, he may lose. Man may have intentions to keep something, may end up giving something up as lost. Verse 7, he mentioned how there's a time to keep, there's also time to throw away, or to cast away. And now in verse 7, he says there is a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. And so the first, there's a time to tear or tear apart. This may refer to the custom of tearing garments in time of deep grief or distress. There's also a time of sowing, or time to sow, to mend. This may refer to mending garments after the time of grief has ended. And so while one may tear, for example, tear his garments in sorrow, there may come a time that he mends those garments. A time of sorrow has ended. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. And so there's a time to be silent and a time to speak or speak up. In 2 Samuel 1, 11 to 12, in 2 Samuel 1, 11 to 12, it says, "Therefore David took hold of his own clothes and tore them. So did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword." When we think of the kings of Israel, we think of Saul and David and Solomon, who wrote the Book of Ecclesiastes. In that passage of 2 Samuel 1, 11 to 12, we see an instance of David and other men tearing their garments so as to express their sorrow. So that may be what he's talking about here. Chapter 3, verse 8. He says, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. The first, there's a time to love. It says there's also a time to hate. We think of love and hate as opposites. These are occasions of affection and hostility. He also describes a time of war, but there are also times to cease from war or to make peace. Of course, in the New Testament, we learn the lesson of Jesus from his Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers. And so we are called to be people of peace, to make peace as much as possible, as much as depends upon us, according to the teachings of Paul. And so verses 1 through 8, everything has its time. One of the lessons that we learn from this section of Scripture is the same lesson that James taught us, as we read earlier from James 4, that we ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall do this or that. And so here in chapter 3 and verse 1, here Solomon describes how there is a time for every purpose under heaven. And so this appointed time for everything, event, matter, an activity. And so if the Lord wills, we shall do this or that. Now in verses 9 through 15, he talks about the God-given task. Verse 9, what profit has the worker from that in which he labors? This is a question that he had asked earlier in the book. This is the main question that he asked at the beginning of the book. What profit has the worker from that in which he labors? Ecclesiastes 1 and 3. What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? And so Solomon sought to find the answer to his question. In chapter 2:11, he said, then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on all the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. And so a life lived apart from God is a life of vanity and grasping the wind. Life under the sun, life lived in this world apart from God. Verse 10, I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. So Solomon says that he has seen the God-given task. What is the task that God has given to men? Verse 11. Solomon wrote, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. And so he says, God has made everything beautiful in its time. God has made everything appropriate. So there is an appointed time for everything. He also put eternity in the hearts of men. There is in every heart a longing for eternal life. Something of eternity in each and every one of us. There is the desire for something more than the works of men under the sun. You may do as Solomon had tried to find profit in the works of his labor apart from God, only to find it vanity of vanity, always vanity. Or you may work for a living and find enjoyment in the work that you do, all the while doing good and fearing God and knowing that there will be the judgment, and having satisfaction, contentment in doing the will of God and enjoying the things of this world while they last, looking for the world to come. Here in verse 11, he speaks about how God has made everything beautiful in its time, everything appropriate. And he also describes how he's put eternity in the hearts of men. Solomon wrote, "No one can find out the work that God does from the beginning to the end." And so man is incapable of, by his intelligence, to understand all that God does in this world. This frustrates some with despair, while thrilling others with hope. It depends on your worldview. What is your worldview? In this case here, is it one of the sinner or is it one of the good? Is it one of the ones who fears God, or is it someone else who disregards the will of God? That will have a lot to say about how you view this world. Verse 12. He says, "I know that nothing is better for them to rejoice and to do good in their lives." The God-given task for man, he says, is to rejoice, to be joyful, to be happy, to rejoice and to do good all the days of their lives. Verse 13. He says, "And that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God." I mentioned the God-given task earlier. Now he's mentioned it as the gift of God. Verse 13. Everyone should find satisfaction in working for a living, for their food and for their drink. Solomon said it is the gift of God. Of course, the one who acknowledges God in his labors. There is a joy in working for a living and doing good. And he describes this as a gift, the joy that comes from God. Verse 14, he says, "I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing can be taken from it. God does it, that men should fear before him." The labor of man is temporary and passing, yet the work of God endures forever and is complete. Man cannot fathom the work that God does from beginning to ending. When we think of the eternity of God, one could not know the beginning of God, who is without beginning, nor the ending of God, who's without ending. With such work as the work of God, man ought to fear God. And we see his conclusion at the end of this book, to fear God. Verse 15. He says, "That which is has already been, and what is to be has already been." And God requires an account of what is past. So verse 15, we see that Solomon looks at the present. He looks at things done in the past, and he looks at what will be done in the future. He wrote, "And God requires an account of what is past." What have you pursued in life? He says man will answer for what he has done. This is a reason to do good and to fear God all the days of our lives. One version notes, God will call the past to account. In Hebrews 9:27, "And as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this, the judgment." And so as it is appointed for man to die, there's also the appointed day of the judgment. Verses 16 to 17, we find that man is appointed to judgment. Verse 16, he says, "Moreover, I saw under the sun, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there." And so Solomon said that he witnessed how wickedness was in the place of judgment or justice. He said that in the place of righteousness was iniquity. And so he saw occasions of wickedness, immorality, where there ought to have been justice. He saw iniquity, this gross injustice, where there ought to have been righteousness. And so this wickedness that Solomon witnessed is said to be under the sun. that is in this world, apart from God. The words wickedness and iniquity in this passage are both from the same Hebrew term. Iniquity is a synonym for wickedness, which stresses injustice. And so he mentions wickedness, and then he mentions wickedness again, specifically as suggested by the term iniquity, that which stresses injustice. And so other versions render it uniformly as wickedness. But in here in the New King James, he mentions wickedness and iniquity. And so there's the wickedness, but there's also the wickedness of injustice in particular. And I think that's the context in which he uses the term wickedness in this passage, in verses 16 and 17. So he looks around and he saw places of judgment where there ought to have been fairness and justice. And what did he see? He saw wickedness. And he looked around in this world at places that ought to have been places of righteousness. And what did he see? In the place of righteousness, he only saw iniquity. Perhaps he looked to the courts, and where he ought to saw judges of righteousness and fairness, righteousness, fairness, equity, what did he see? He saw wickedness and inequity. Verse 17, he said, I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. Back to the appointed time. Remember at the beginning of the chapter, he said there's a time for everything. And again here in this passage, there's a time for every purpose and for every work. And in this passage, he's speaking specifically of the time for judgment. Chapter 3, verse 1, he says, to everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. And so Solomon says in his heart, having witnessed the wickedness under the sun, that there is a time appointed by God of judgment for every righteous and every wicked purpose and work of men. And so we see here that God will judge both the righteous man and God will judge the wicked man as well. There is this time for everything, time for every activity, time to judge every deed. In the New Testament, Paul said in 2 Corinthians 5 and 10, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in the body according to what has been done, whether good or bad. And so here in Ecclesiastes, and with more fullness, we see in the New Testament, judgment of the wicked and the righteous, the judgment of everyone. Verses 18 to 22, we see that man is appointed to judgment, but man is also appointed to death. Verse 18, he said, I said in my heart concerning the conditions of the sons of men, God tests them that they may see that they themselves are like animals. And so Solomon said that God requires an account of what is past. Here in chapter 3, verse 15, he described the wickedness and the iniquity of men. He may have specifically referred to men in positions of authority to judge who perverted justice. Ultimately, God will judge. Ecclesiastes 3, 16 and 17. Remember that at the beginning of his reign, Solomon asked God for understanding to discern justice in 1 Kings 3:11. And so God gave him a wise and understanding heart in 1 Kings 3 and 12. The people of Israel saw Solomon render judgment and administer justice with the wisdom of God. 1 Kings chapter 3 and 28. Solomon said here in verse 18 that the sons of men are like animals. They're like beasts. Sure, those who perverted justice acted like beasts without righteousness. However, the point that he emphasized was that they were like animals, not that they were the same or exactly the same, but they were like animals in something. How are they like animals? How are they like beasts? Well, they were alike in that the same event happens to both men and animals. The event is the appointment of death. Ecclesiastes 3 and 19. He says, "For what happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them, as one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity." So here in verse 19, he points out that death happens to both animals and to men. As one dies, so dies the other. Each has only one breath, one life. And in this matter, man has no advantage over animals. Of course, there are advantages that we may point out inside and outside of the scriptures. But in this particular matter, he's saying that is in the matter of dying, man has no advantage. And so as man dies, so does the animal. Earlier, Solomon contrasted the wise and the fool. Why should the wise boast of how much wiser they are than the fool? Death comes to both the wise and the fool, he pointed out in chapter 2, 15 to 16. Now, instead of the fool, he's speaking of the animals. Verse 20. He says, all go to one place, all are from dust, and all return to dust. And so the bodies of both man and animals all go to one place. In our death, our fleshly bodies, which came from the dust of the earth, will return to the dust of the earth. We learn this in Genesis 3:19. Moses records, "In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return." And so the bodies of men and animals return to the ground from where they came. Verse 21, he says, "Who knows the spirit of the sons of men, which goes upward, and the spirit of the animal, which goes down to the earth?" In a fleshly sense, man is like the animals, which die and return to the earth. However, according to Solomon, there is a difference which the sinner may not know. The animal in death returns to the dust of the earth. The spirit goes down to the earth. The man who fears God understands that his spirit returns to God in death. The spirit of man, he says, ascends upward. Compare this to Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7, where Solomon wrote, "Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." And so here in verse 21, we note that the spirit of the sons of men goes upward. It returns to God who gave the spirit to men. And while the body of man goes to the dust of the earth, as does the body of the animal, we find that the spirit of men ascends upward, returns to God who gave it. Verse 22, "So I perceive that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him?" Our last verse for this chapter, Solomon describes how we ought to enjoy the things that as men we have worked for during our life. And he describes this as your inheritance, your heritage. You will not come back to see what happens after you die, will you? And so there is the man who is troubled that he must leave his heritage to a man to enjoy who has not labored for it. Ecclesiastes 2:21. And in this passage, his heritage refers to his property and to his possessions. And other versions read, instead of heritage, describe everything or all that they own. Solomon taught that there is satisfaction that comes to a man who works for a living, enjoying eating and drinking, and the drink for which he has worked, for which he has labored, seeing it as a blessing of God. Apart from God, who can find true contentment? Ecclesiastes 2:24-26. And so the lesson here is to enjoy the things that you have worked for, which you have from God, all the days of your life, which Solomon says are from God. He says it is your heritage, Ecclesiastes 5:18 and 19. It is your heritage. It is your reward. As a side note here in this passage, I want to point out that this word heritage in the New King James Version occurs 4 times. In chapter 2 and 21, 3 and 22, 5 and 18, and 5 and 19. And so this English word heritage may refer to property that descends to an heir. It may literally be translated as share or portion. And so what is our heritage? What is our share? What is our portion? In this passage, his heritage was that a man should rejoice in his work, verse 22. His portion was not the property that he would leave to an heir when he died. His share was to be glad for what God had blessed him with while he was still here. And so as you study this passage in verses 18 to 22, you see that man is not only appointed to judgment, man is appointed to death. A life lived, according to Solomon, a life lived apart from God is a life of vanity. Granted, there may be pleasures in this world. Those pleasures are passing. They're fleeting, temporary. And as the life of man is temporary, so are those pleasures. However, Solomon found contentment in working for a living. That is, that man should work for a living for the things that he has to eat and to drink, to enjoy those things, enjoy the fruits of his labor. But not just to live for work or to live for food and drink, for those fruits of our labor, but to look forward with the fear of God to the time of judgment, the time after the body returns to the dust of the earth and spirit returns to God who gave it. And sometime after death, we'll see that there is the judgment, according to the Old and New Testament, as we see here. We hope that you've been benefited in what we have studied today. There's certainly, as oftentimes there are, many other things that could be said, but these are some of the things that were prepared for today's lesson. We hope that you continue to study on your own. Next time, Lord willing, we'll continue with Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Until that time, continue studying and seeking the truth of God's word. Thank you for being here for this lesson.